small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, there was a time when First NBC and Whitney were competitors. Now they are one, though a Mississippi bank is calling the shots. Two other troubled properties, Jazzland and the World Trade Center, have received some needed attention, and a Louisiana senator is getting attention with the national health care legislation. We'll look at these stories as well as the latest from the legislature, the monuments controversy, and the New Orleans mayor's race. On the ballot for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Aboard, producer of Informed Sources; Stephanie Grace, columnist, the New Orleans Advocate; Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist; and Jessica Williams, reporter, the New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go to Kathy first and talk about a bank failure here in our area in the past couple of weeks.
Right, and we've been talking about this for a while, and the latest news this week is that First NBC Bank has declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and this was reported by the Advocate reporter Rick Thompson. Actually went through the documents. I have to give him credit for the information coming out of the bankruptcy filing. And it looks like they declared they had $65 million in debt and $8 million in assets, so it's not a pretty picture, but we knew this was coming. This is sort of the final step to the bank's demise. The federal regulators, of course, stepped in a few weeks ago and took it over completely, closed down the bank. Again, we knew this was coming, and Whitney took over what we call the good assets, the good loans, the good portfolio. The FDIC assumed all of the bad stuff, the bad lending, the bad loans, the things that were going south, and to the tune of the cost of about $1 billion to taxpayers, the FDIC will assume all of that burden. So the good news for depositors in the local area is that you're not hurt, you are covered, you're safe, your money is safe. Assuming you have not moved your money out of First NBC, it has gone over to the Whitney accounts. And you won't see much difference, except the name, of course, will change in the bank. This all came about, as we know now, because the founder of the bank, Ashton Ryan, got heavily involved in the tax credit business. Not him personally, but he got the bank involved in all of that. And it's an unusual situation, kind of. He founded the bank. Of course, the name of First NBC came from the original First National Bank of Commerce, which went way back. Ashton Ryan was an executive in that bank, and it had a very fine reputation, and was, eventually it was taken over by another bank. But he came back in 2006. It was a post-Hurricane Katrina situation. He wanted to do something in the community and really start a lot of, some entrepreneurial lending and that sort of thing. He founded this bank, became the CEO, and he called it First NBC Bank to harken back to First National Bank of Commerce, which had a great reputation. But he delved heavily into the tax credit business, both buying tax credits and then having the bank actually lend money on projects that those tax credits were issued for. And it just became a very high-risk situation, and it went south. I mean, there was too much risk in the portfolio. I really think one of the main problems here is that it was just too complicated. Regulators like straightforward banking. Banks that make loans, take in deposits, look at your industry sectors. You see this sort of thing happen in situations, for instance, in the 1980s and early 90s when we had a severe downturn in the energy industry, which then invaded the real estate market, and you just had banks falling right and left because their portfolios were going south. Borrowers were not paying on the loans. This is not that kind of situation at all. I'm sure First NBC Bank had some of that lending, had some oil and gas loans in there that may have been subject to this downturn. But they were taken down by the tax credit lending and the tax credit investments.
Tax credits would do no good if you're not making a profit. If
well,
you don't
correct.
make a profit, you don't have to pay taxes.
Correct.
So.
You have to have a profit to take credits against, and if you don't,
and what are the tax credits? Are we talking about like the redevelopment tax credits around town, or
a lot of that was, yes. They were construction projects that were eligible for that kind of credits, and so the bank would go out and get the credits and then also lend money on the projects themselves, and it just became a very difficult thing to do. And And I think it became difficult to evaluate. Auditors find it difficult to look at that in a portfolio and say, well, what is this actually worth? And especially if you can't, what is the tax credit worth? It's not like looking at a loan for $100,000 on a building that's going to contain retail stores or apartment buildings or something like that, where you know what the revenue is going to be on that project, and you can weigh that against the risk of the loan. The tax credits complicate that picture enormously. And if the regulators want to step in at some point and say, well, we think you should revalue your portfolio because we don't think the values you've put on these credits are fair, you could see the value plunge very quickly, and I think that did happen.
There was a time when it wasn't too long ago when outside competition wasn't allowed in the banking, before multi-parish banking. And I remember first NBC originally was called the National Bank of Commerce. And it was one of those banks with a big office tower downtown. It had a big office tower and a big sign that said NBC. So we were like Rockefeller Center.
Yes.
Okay, no, it's okay. And then there was a merge and became First NBC, and then it went under and kind of came back as that.
Well, this feels like a real anachronism because, I mean, banks are not failing right now. This is I think the fourth one in the country for this year. And so it's quite an unusual circumstance, and it's too bad.
And so just for depositors, just for someone who banked with them, just everyday banking, that continues just through the Whitney and the branches, though. There might see some changes in branches.
No doubt. I mean, we know earlier that before the bank actually failed and was taken over, Whitney had taken over some of the branches and taken some of the deposits. And it looked like some of that, of course, left duplications where branches were too close together, and so some of those certainly would close. I don't think we know exactly yet, but depositors need not be concerned about their money.
Okay, Kathy, thanks a lot for filling us in on that.
Yes.
Over to Stephanie right now, and mayor's race. We
Yes.
have, three really announced candidates.
Three announced candidates. So Michael Bagnaris, the former civil court judge, Latoya Cantrell, the city council member, Frank Spurlock, thank you, who is known for that skywriting over Jazz Fest, and also he got arrested at one of the monument protests this week. So he got a little bump there, I guess, if that's what you want. Desiree Charbonnet's hanging out there. She hasn't announced, but she is another former judge who had to resign her post in order to run. So she's resigned, but she has not announced yet. But they're definitely putting a campaign together. So maybe four. And frankly, people are starting to think that maybe that might be it at this point. There are other names out there, a couple of legislators who are really busy up in Baton Rouge, Walt Leger, J.P. Morrell. Walt Leger started putting a campaign together, has spent some money on research, but that seems to be on hold, at least for now. J.P. Morrell really hasn't done much of anything. He said, maybe I'll look at it later. Karen Carter-Peterson is always out there, but she really hasn't done much. We don't know. We haven't really even heard from Cindy Torres much lately.
Right, and it's getting close to qualifying.
And it is. It's about, 2 months? So middle of July.
Well, sometimes, and Mitch Landrieu did this himself, sometimes it's best to delay the announcement.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to say not just Mitch Landrieu, but Ray Nagin and Mark Morial were all late entrants.
Because the earlier you make it, the earlier you become a target.
Yeah.
Okay, especially if you're a legislator. And so sometimes it's best, especially if you have name recognition already and you have some money, it won't take that long to put together a campaign. Now, if you don't have name recognition, you need to go early. So.
And there's money on the sidelines at this point. There are some people thinking at this point you might have to be self-funded to get in very late. And of course, Sidney Torres could do that and has said he would do that if he runs. The business community really hasn't coalesced behind anybody at this point. So I think if somebody appealing to them got in, that person could raise some money pretty quickly.
And so also there's an issue of, it's a little bit different in terms of the timing of when qualifying is going to be held, when we're going to go to the polls to vote. It's just different.
We can't even say 4 years ago because it was 3.5 years ago. So we always had New Orleans municipal elections, remember, February, and then runoffs in March. So we would run into Mardi Gras and the Super Bowl, and somehow we always had big elections when either the Saints were in the Super Bowl or there was the Super Bowl in town. They pushed that back. League of Women Voters really supported it. There was legislation to basically pull the elections back to the previous fall. So basically, we're having this election about 3.5 years after the previous one, but because people were elected under the old system, their term runs the full 4 years. So we're going to have a strange situation where we'll have a new mayor and city council elected in definitely November, possibly October if there's no runoff. But Mitch Landrieu is going to be there till May, so that's going to be a really interesting
That is
period.
gonna be.
But one of the things that I think is maybe confusing people who are used to a certain rhythm is, for example, we have legislators who could possibly be candidates, but their plates are full right now, and they need to be.
And they may continue to be busy over the course of summer, which we're going to talk about
Yes.
in a little while.
The
Okay,
day
so
Mitch Landrieu was first elected, he was elected in the primary on a Saturday, and that was the day before the Saints were in the Super Bowl.
was.
Right.
That was quite the weekend.
It was. I have
it
to say,
was-
he got himself into the parade. So, like, I think that's the only way anybody was going to pay attention to him after the
I
Saints
remember on
won.
the show that Friday night, what did we talk
Yeah.
about? The mayor's election and the Super Bowl. Yeah, so.
Well, and also remember the Nagin election in 2002. That was the Super Bowl here in New Orleans. This is the primary, but it was also the first Super Bowl after 9/11. So it was a very big deal. And I remember at the Picayune, we had kind of this front page, what do you do?
a
And it
dilemma
was-
there,
yes.
right? So basically 2 months to
2 months.
the end of qualifying. So if somebody's going to jump in, they're going to have to jump in fairly soon.
We had one development this week. Michael Bagnaris, who
Right.
ran against Mitch Landrieu 3.5 years ago, not 4, had a kickoff this week. He had already said he was running. And we're already seeing that his campaign's going to be different because when he ran against Mitch Landrieu, his focus was very much on Mitch Landrieu, and the people who kind of were angry at Mitch Landrieu all coalesced around him. Now it's, I think, he talked a lot more about himself than he did last time. Last
Okay.
night.
There's an entertainment side to that family, most
Yeah.
notable Vernell, who goes by Bonaris. And I remember seeing Michael Bagnaris one time and asked him, what is it with your family? Are you Bagnaris or you Bonaris?
Right.
He says, the politicians are Bagnaris, the
That's
entertainers
funny.
are Bonaris.
I will say Vernell Bonaris was at his announcement last night. So.
Either way, it's a lovely name. Okay, thanks a lot, Steph. Over to
Sure.
Jessica right now. And World Trade Center, Jazzland, 2 important properties, and
Yeah, we're finally seeing some movement
Some
on.
movement. We're hearing some things about them. So let's start with World Trade Center.
So the World Trade Center has been embroiled in litigation for 2 years, and just last month we finally got a ruling from the Louisiana Supreme Court that essentially threw out the case of a losing bidder who sought to redevelop the project and who sued and claimed that the city's process was unfair. The Supreme Court has ruled against him. He also tried to file a bankruptcy in a Florida court in order to further drag out the case. However, the city doesn't have any confidence that that's going to go anywhere, and the Four Seasons team is moving ahead with the project.
So, because they have been delayed, waiting for all of this to move through the courts. When you say they're moving ahead with the project, I know interior demolition
They're going to
was
start
scheduled for
with an
April.
interior demolition in April. That's going to take about
So
6 months.
they did start that.
They did. And then after that, they're going to move into renovations of the property. They're going to move into renovating the parking, which is the final piece, in 2019, and preparing for an opening date of fall 2019.
And then also, because of all the litigation, the pending litigation, they were not able to get title insurance, which is really important if you're going to move along with a project. Have they been able to secure that now?
Because their view is that the litigation is completely dead at this point, they will be able to move forward and get title insurance. Basically, anytime there's a lawsuit that's hanging over your property, that creates an issue for folks that are willing to hand out that insurance. But now that they've moved forward, they've gotten what they needed to get cleared, they're moving forward with work, we can safely assume that they've gotten everything that they need in order to progress with the project.
So it's going to be a Ritz-Carlton property opening in 2019 is what we're seeing right now.
A Four Seasons property
Four
opening
Seasons,
in
I'm
2019.
sorry.
Hotel and
Sorry, big mistake there.
condominiums.
Four Seasons, okay.
Four Seasons property.
All right, let's talk now about Jazzland. I mean, that has been empty, just lying there doing nothing since Hurricane Katrina, and there have been groups saying, hey, I want to come into development, but nothing's moved forward.
Since Hurricane Katrina, and it's a tricky site because it's been an amusement park twice already, and neither one of those iterations really worked out financially. And so the city's struggle over the past year, or the public board who has been in charge of the property struggle over the past year, has been, who do we give this to? The 3 developers who have come forth, who say they want the property, who say they're willing to spend cash on the property, they all want to turn it into some form of an amusement park. But the general consensus is that that is not the best use for what this property, that may not be the best use for what this property can really do or can really be. So let's come back to the drawing board. The Industrial Development Board actually just this past week approved a CEA with the city, which would allow Burbridge Landrieu's administration, rather than the 15-member volunteer board that has been handling this process for this entire 5-year period, to come in and to go out and court developers or someone who would take over the property and do something with it. And the hope is that that is going to breathe some life into this process that has been stalled for the better part of 5 years.
So whoever wants to do something with it will now deal directly with the mayor's office,
yes.
through the Department of Economic Development?
Yes, exactly.
As opposed to a board?
As opposed to a 15-member board with minimal staff who has, for the better part of the last 5 years, handled security on the property, managed the property, but has not really been able to secure the level of development proposal that it wanted.
And then does this only go until the end of the Landry administration? Is that?
The CEA is in effect for 1 year,
Okay.
and they did it that way because that was the way that they could avoid having to go through a larger process to get it approved. But the CEA is effective for 1 year, and 6 months in, the Industrial Development Board and Landry will come together. They'll lay out everything that they found so far as developers who are willing to look at the property and decide collectively how they want to move forward.
Okay.
So we'll see repeated updates from the city on their efforts at each Industrial Development Board meeting.
Which could include an outright sale of the property to somebody.
It could
instead
lead
of
to an outright sale. It could
Well,
lead
what the
to a
Landry
lease.
administration has left is like 2 weeks less than a year, and so it almost has a year. I've always said, the problem that area has in terms of attracting people, the two psychological barriers with the I-10 high-rise on one side and then the 6 Mile Bridge on the other. So if you look at the population centers in New Orleans on the other side, or in Metairie, or over in St. Tammany Parish, it takes a lot of convincing, to want to make that. It's a long drive for most people to go there. And so I think it's going to always have a hard time being a family attraction. It probably needs to be something with guys driving trucks,
So we'll find out over the next 6 months or so.
Yes, we will.
See how things are progressing. All right, thanks a lot, Jessica. Errol, back over to you now. And we saw another monument come down this week.
Yeah, this is a gut-wrenching story. I mean, no matter which side you're on, I live kind of close to where Jeff Davis is. Now it's just a big blank space right now. And actually, you think about all that's happened, and the hard part is still ahead, because the two monuments to the left are, I think, are the ones that are going to have the most emotional impact, the most history, the two that are the most significant pieces of art, the two that were most visible to the community, the two that have people for which cases can be made. Beauregard had a fairly impressive post-war record, including being an advocate of integrating public schools. And so all this is going to start all over again. I know the mayor was kind of hoping that by the time they got to this stage that people would be kind of worn out and it would be more successful. But if there's any statues that I think can bring back the passions, I think it'll start all over again. But what's curious about this story, Stephanie, especially as we're talking about the mayor's race, is that the form of government we have in New Orleans is called a strong mayor council form of government. And boy, do we have a strong mayor. Okay.
Yes, we do.
And perhaps some would say maybe a little bit too strong, because I don't recall a public issue, a controversial public issue, that has been dominated totally by the mayor and not anybody else in political life. Like
there were council members that got involved and spoke up.
well, they voted at the beginning,
Right,
but
and
since
made
then they really haven't. After in their vote was what the vote the mayor said that he wanted. Okay, and so I mean, you go back to the police strike in '79. I mean, that was Dutch Morial who was steering all that, as the mayor should. But there were council members involved with it, and certainly with the recovery, and certainly with various things. And this, it seems like everybody else has kind of like stood aside, and it's been the mayor's.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like Mark Morial did some things like that. I'm remembering the day he pulled me aside and he said, "We're going to change the name of the airport to Louis Armstrong Airport," and then they just did because he's the mayor. So but it's a very strong mayor system. So if you have a strong personality, it's certainly set up for that.
Yeah, even though I don't think that was a big controversial issue.
It wasn't.
Yeah, I don't think that was. I don't think that was anything that really struck people emotionally. But it's just a peculiar thing, and I just think it's something that maybe this being a mayoral election, the city election year, maybe it needs to be addressed. It seems like something. I know that there are times in public life where a chief executive needs to make a strong, decisive decision in a hurry. There are some issues, especially things dealing with public safety or something. But there are other times there's something that really kind of just affect the culture and the lifestyle of a community. Maybe the community needs to be brought into the discussion a little bit more.
Well, it was obviously something that the Mayor Landrieu, really did
Right.
believe in. And he had a piece
another-
in the Washington Post about it,
He
I believe
did.
it was yesterday.
He's gotten a lot of national press about it. I mean, there are other examples of mayors supporting and city council voting on very controversial issues that people did not get a chance to vote on. One that comes to mind is closing the public housing projects, which
Right.
certainly was very
It was very
emotional
controversial,
and,
yeah.
again, not put to a vote of the people. So that's really the form of government we have.
So we have two other very prominent monuments that are scheduled to come down. Both of the ones so far have been in the dead of night. I guess we would anticipate the others are going to be done the same
don't
way.
know.
We
I
don't
don't
know.
know.
And we don't know
That would
when.
be the case.
Yeah.
But you know, that public housing issue, I thought that was a good moment in government that day that actually the mayor and the council, it was Mayor Nagin at the time,
Yeah.
all stood together side by side on that. And I said, this is, and people, I think public sentiment agreed with that also. So I thought that was
Well, there
a
were a
good
lot of
moment.
protests, and they got
Yeah, indeed. Okay, we have to move on now to our next topic, but we do know that the other two are slated to come down and probably will be fairly soon. All right, over to Stephanie now. And our senator, Dr.
senior senator. Yes.
Yeah, our senior senator, Dr. Bill Cassidy, has really become very prominent in the healthcare debate.
In a very short time. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel, that's a nice big platform. That's where he was on Monday night.
And he coined a
And
new phrase now.
He did, and Jimmy Kimmel likes it because it's the Jimmy Kimmel test.
Right, that means Senator Cassidy coined that phrase.
And so what happened is Jimmy Kimmel, the late night talk show host, has a newborn son who was born with some difficulties, had to have heart surgery. And he went on the air and made just a very emotional plea that went viral that basically said he was looking at the other parents. He's trying to imagine if he didn't have the resources he had. He said, you know, we've got to get ourselves together. This is not about which team you're on. This is about whether, you know, this children will live their lives suffering because they have pre-existing conditions, whether families will face caps in coverage if something catastrophic happens. And Bill Cassidy, who was already kind of out there talking about health care and really trying to moderate the Republican repeal and replace drive somewhat, keyed in on that, and he said, well, I'm not going to support something that doesn't pass the Jimmy Kimmel test. So then Jimmy Kimmel had him on, and they had a little back and forth about what the Jimmy Kimmel test was. And, you know, it's really more a statement of principle than policies, but it involves pre-existing, you know, these things that everyone's talking about, pre-existing condition coverage, lifetime caps on coverage, things like that.
Well, he
the
has
real protections
co-authored
from Obamacare.
a proposal with Susan Collins from Maine.
He has.
But in all of these interviews, you do see him really sort of directed back to the president, saying, this is what we're trying to do, what the president is trying to do.
And he's talking to the president almost because, you know, the House passed this bill that a lot of people would say does not represent the things the president promised during the campaign, you know, keeping various protections that are very popular from Obamacare in place. And Bill Cassidy says very directly, what I'm talking about is keeping the president's promise. You know, it's really kind of remarkable to see this because if you all remember his campaign against Mary Landrieu in 2014, it was really one note. It was Obama, like you said, Obama, Obama, Obama. Mary Landrieu voted with Obama. That was his argument against her, and it was successful. Things like that were successful against a lot of Republicans. Now, she wasn't voting with Obama on oil and gas, things like that. The key example was the Health Care Act. So he was, you know, there was really no reason going in to think he wouldn't be kind of a party line vote. But I think the difference is that, you know, President Obama was still in. They weren't going to pass anything, so it was politics. But now that it's reality, this is a guy who worked in the charity hospital system.
Right.
And he's getting calls from his constituents
and boy
about
is
this.
he, and he's going to town hall meetings, and he's having them to
we are
his
seeing
credit.
him, at least in the national media, is really going to him, but he's not on the task force that Mitch McConnell
And
put
that's
together.
really interesting because now that the bill has gone to the Senate and the Senate says we're going to start from
Right.
scratch, Mitch
He's not on
McConnell
there.
put together a group of people. He's not on it, which I think tells you where he is versus McConnell. Yet he's going out and doing interviews all over the place. He's getting a lot of press, so I
Right.
think he's kind of lobbying from the outside.
Okay, Steph, thanks. And now over to Kathy. Quickly, we need to take a look at what's happening with retail. It's kind of having to redefine itself.
Well, you're hearing the headlines all the time, business headlines right now, is that retail sales are down, things are not looking that great. We saw, of course, coming out of the holiday period after Christmas and New Year's and so forth, you always hear about the impact of online sales and how e-commerce has picked up so strongly and it's hurting the brick and mortar stores, and that just continues. And it's becoming sort of just an irreversible drumbeat now. It's going to continue. It doesn't mean that the retail, you know, the brick and mortar stores are going to go go away. It simply means that now they've got to fight a lot harder to maintain what they're doing in those stores at the same time that they're competing online, because every one of those stores has its own web presence as well, and they've got to do e-commerce. They're up against hard competitors who are offering free shipping, free returns, and just making it so easy for consumers to buy from their computers or even their phones that fewer and fewer of them are going out and shopping in the stores.
It is getting easier and easier just to do it online. Are we seeing any retailers, closing here?
Well, we've seen, of course, announcements of major chains: Macy's, H.H. Gregg, Sears, and a few of those stores are going to close here. We've seen Macy's at the Esplanade, what you're seeing is the impact on the malls, because the malls don't have the life that they used to have. I mean, they're definitely on the downside of their prime years, and it's because people are just not going out there. And you look at Lakeside Mall, which has always been a powerhouse, and if you look at sales in the early part of this year, the sales tax collections out there, they're down. The malls struggle, and if like at the Esplanade, if they lose a major anchor store like Macy's, think how hard that is to replace that and that amount of space out there. So it's a very difficult struggle, and you see it's mostly in Jefferson Parish because that's where the malls are.
And that's going to have a ripple effect on parish government too, if they're not getting the tax collection.
It will indeed. In downtown, of course, you have another thing you're seeing is the shops at Canal Place, which is a very upscale mall and always been quite successful, and has a major Saks Fifth Avenue store there. But what you're seeing in Orleans Parish and elsewhere is that the prices for retail space, if somebody wants to come in and buy space or lease space, prices are going down, which means demand for those physical spaces is going down. And you saw Canal Place the shops at Canal Place changed hands several months ago.
Online shopping, I know, is not going away. It's so easy for me as a grandmother with children in Indiana just to order something and get it up for a birthday like the one today of my 5-year-old grandson, Barrett. Happy birthday, Barrett. Okay, time to look ahead. Errol.
Barry's probably not looking.
Barrett,
okay.
But folks might be.
Nunez Community College in Chalmette, for the first time ever, is going to enter intercollegiate competition. It's going to field a baseball team next season. There's a division in college competitions for junior colleges. So the Nunez Pelicans will probably someday be playing the Delgado Dolphins, and may have become a great rivalry.
Okay. Steph.
The legislature should be kind of wrapping up, but it's not. Budget is now going over to the Senate. There's a huge gap between what Governor Edwards wants and what the House Republicans, who kind of control things, want. People are really expecting that it's going to go to a special session again.
All right. Kathy.
Tourists and others strolling the riverfront are going to get a little more protection in the evenings and night times, thanks to the Harbor Police starting bike patrols along the riverfront. So that's a new development, and should be an interesting one, both from the standpoint of seeing them out there on their bikes, but also protection for the pedestrians.
Okay.
Speaking of the legislature, state legislators are working together right now to possibly erase the ban on strip club dancers younger than 21. They're going over a bill right now that just got passed through committee, and on the local level, the city council is expected to take up a decision on whether or not to cap the number of strip clubs on Bourbon Street this month or next.
Okay. Thanks, you guys, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. Of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod & Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.